In 1929, it all came undone in a single day. One morning, Wall Street's titans were millionaires. By dinner, they were broke. Banks that had stood for generations vanished overnight, and almost no one saw it coming. Then again, they never do. Because 2 years earlier, every red light was flashing exploding credit, wild speculation, obscene inequality. And everyone said the same 4 deadly words: this time is different. Fast forward almost a century, and the pattern should feel familiar. 2008 followed the same script: easy money, asset bubbles, arrogance. But here's the twist that should stop you cold. Today, in 2025, the warning signs are back: extreme valuations, historic inequality, fragile systems, but the credit boom isn't. That's not just strange, that's unprecedented. And if we've learned anything from history, it's this: when the boom looks safe, that's when the bomb is already ticking. Every economic collapse, from the South Sea bubble to 2008, has shared one common villain: credit. Cheap loans flood the system, speculation runs wild, and when the tide turns, the leverage crushes everything. That's how bubbles are born. But here's the paradox: this time, the credit machine is quiet. Private debt, both household and corporate, is at its lowest level in 20 years. The data is right there in the Federal Reserve's own April 2025 report. So if the banks aren't lending recklessly, who's inflating the bubble? The uncomfortable answer: central banks themselves. After 2008, they created money out of thin air, trillions in quantitative easing, and used it to buy assets. They didn't lend to homeowners or factories. They pumped it straight into stocks, bonds, and housing markets. The result? An economy floating on printed money, not productive credit. A bubble without a boom. And that, history shows, is even more dangerous. Because when the safety net becomes the bubble itself, who catches us when it bursts? To understand what's happening now, we have to go way back to when the pattern first appeared. It starts with credit. When banks lend aggressively, money floods into the economy. But most of that credit doesn't build new factories or hire new workers. It chases assets: housing, stocks, land. That's what economists Scar Jord, Moritz Schullerich, and Alan Taylor called the Great Mortgaging. Throughout the 20th century, the share of mortgages on bank balance sheets doubled. The system tied itself to real estate like an anchor to a ship: heavy, profitable, and ultimately dangerous. When credit is cheap, house prices climb. As prices climb, more buyers rush in, expecting easy profit. Banks lend more to feed the frenzy. It's a perfect self-reinforcing loop until it isn't. The Bank for International Settlements found a pattern that should have made headlines decades ago. When credit grows much faster than GDP for too long, the credit to GDP gap, a crisis, almost always follows. Not always, but almost. So much so that global banking laws, Basel III, now use it as a warning gauge. When the gap widens, banks must build a rainy day fund called a counter-cyclical buffer. But history shows that by the time regulators sound the alarm, the damage is already done. Let's rewind to some of the first collapses that taught this brutal lesson. 1720, the South Sea Bubble. A company promised Britain endless wealth through trade with South America. Investors poured in, borrowing and leveraging to chase profits that never existed. Shares rose nearly tenfold. Even members of parliament were bribed to keep the illusion alive. And when it burst, fortunes evaporated, lives were destroyed, and the country swore it had learned its lesson. Spoiler: it hadn't. 1893, the Panic of 1893. Railroads were the tech stocks of the 19th century, financed by cheap money and dreams of expansion. But when Argentina's financial system collapsed in 1890, panic spread. European investors demanded gold. America's gold reserves drained fast, worsened by the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which forced the U.S. Treasury to buy silver. Confidence in the gold standard broke. Banks failed. Unemployment soared. And just like that, an age of progress ended in misery. Then came 1929. The roaring 20s: cars, radios, and optimism. Credit was explode, inequality extreme, and people were borrowing 90% of stock purchases on margin. When the Federal Reserve raised rates to slow speculation, the whole tower cracked. From 1930 to 1933, the Fed made its gravest mistake. It didn't act as the lender of last resort. Money supply collapsed by 30%, and a normal downturn became the Great Depression. But here's what history hides. The Depression wasn't just a market failure. It was a policy failure, a man-made catastrophe of hesitation and pride. Fast forward again to 2000. The dot-com bubble inflated on hype and venture capital. Tech companies with no profits were worth billions. When reality hit, trillions in wealth disappeared overnight. Then came 2008, the great mortgaging's final act. Banks lent to anyone with a pulse. Subprime loans, no documentation, teaser rates. They bundled those mortgages into exotic products, CDSs that even the experts didn't understand. The system was more connected than ever. When housing prices slipped, the entire global machine fell apart. Many blamed the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999, but economists later found something deeper. It wasn't the merger of commercial and investment banks that doomed the system, it was the rise of the shadow banking system, the unregulated market of synthetic products that no one was watching. By 2008, Minsky's warning had come true. Stability had bred instability. The more safe it seemed, the more fragile it became. And each time, the same words echoed through boardrooms and headlines. This time is different, but it never is. Here's the thing about financial systems, they're not destroyed by chaos. They're destroyed by memory loss. Each generation convinces itself it's smarter than the last. They build the same tower of credit, just with shinier materials. Step 1. Credit expands. Banks lend. Leverage grows. Step 2. Asset prices rise. Everyone feels richer. Step 3. Risk seems to vanish. And right there, in that false calm, the countdown begins. Economist Hyman Minsky mapped this perfectly in his financial instability hypothesis. During stable times, people forget risk. Lenders relax their standards. Borrowers overreach. The system becomes more interconnected, more leveraged, more fragile. Stability itself becomes the seed of collapse. And when it finally breaks, it's always the same story. Falling prices trigger margin calls. Margin calls force selling. Selling crashes prices even more. The same self-reinforcing loop that built the boom now fuels the fall, just in reverse. But financial collapse isn't only math. It's psychology. The belief that this time is different blinds entire societies. Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff studied 8 centuries of crises and found one chilling constant. Every bubble is powered by collective amnesia. Each new generation forgets the pain of the last one and repeats the same dance, just with new music. Then comes the social poison, inequality. In the decades before both 1929 and 2008, wealth concentrated at the top. The top 1% captured an outsized share of income. The middle hollowed out. It's the same setup every time, too much capital chasing too few assets, while ordinary people borrow to keep up. But here's where economists split. Raghuram Rajan argued that rising inequality weakens demand, pushing policymakers to expand credit so people can spend. Others, like Michael Bordo and Christopher Meissner, disagreed. They studied data from 14 rich countries over 80 years and found no direct link between inequality and credit booms. Their finding? Low interest rates and long expansions were the real drivers. So maybe inequality doesn't cause credit bubbles, maybe they ray both symptoms of the same disease. A broken policy regime. Deregulation, easy money, capture by elites who profit most when risk is privatized and losses are socialized. Either way, the outcome is the same. When the system looks its strongest, full employment, record markets, optimism everywhere, that's when it's weakest. Because under the surface, risk isn't gone. It's simply been transferred, hidden, and multiplied. And when confidence cracks, it all unravels faster than anyone believes possible. The pattern didn't end with 2008. It evolved. And what's forming today doesn't fit the old map. Now, here's where the story takes a sharp turn, because 2025 isn't following the script. The signs of danger are all flashing, but the usual culprit is missing. In the past, Every great crash was born from a private credit boom. Banks lent too much. People borrowed too much. But right now, that engine is cold. According to the Federal Reserve's April 2025 Financial Stability Report, total private non-financial debt, both household and business, has been falling relative to GDP. We're at the lowest debt ratio in 2 decades. No runaway lending, no subprime explosion, no housing mania built on borrowed cash. And yet, look around. Asset valuations are on fire. The Shiller P/E ratio sits around 39.7, more than double the long-term average of 17.7, higher than 1929, just shy of the 2000 tech bubble. Home prices have outpaced incomes to the point that the price-to-income ratio is worse than at the peak of the 2000s housing boom. The IMF's October 2025 Global Financial Stability Report flat out warns of stretched valuations and extreme wealth concentration. How can we have a bubble without a credit boom? Because this one wasn't built by Wall Street, it was engineered by central banks. After 2008, they learned one lesson: when crisis hits, print money and cut rates to zero. The lesson worked until it didn't. They kept those rates near zero for more than a decade. They created trillions of new dollars through quantitative easing and bought government bonds, mortgage securities, even corporate debt. All that liquidity didn't flow into Main Street. It flowed into the markets. Stocks soared. Housing soared. The wealthy who already owned most assets saw their net worth double, then triple. Meanwhile, the middle class lost ground. By mid-2025, the top 1% of Americans held about 31% of total wealth. The bottom half of the country, just 2.5%. That's the widest gap since the Fed began tracking the data in 1989. So here's the paradox at the heart of the modern economy. We've built the biggest bubble in history without the fuel that used to ignite it. This is the great decoupling: valuations detached from credit, prices detached from production, wealth detached from work. And the structural cracks run deeper than the balance sheets. Manufacturing, the backbone of real resilience, has been hollowed out. Entire towns that once built cars and steel now build debt and despair. The middle class, once the stabilizer of democracy, has been replaced by a polarized, precarious economy of asset owners and renters. That's not just bad economics. That's a recipe for social collapse. Then add the global stage. The post-war order that kept trade stable is fracturing. China is rising, America is over-leveraged, and geopolitical tensions are simmering across every major region. Trade wars, sanctions, resource shocks, all the ingredients that once triggered localized recessions could now ignite something much bigger. This isn't fear-mongering, it's arithmetic. Every empire falls the same way, not because it ran out of money, but because it forgot where the money came from. Let's bring this home literally. What does all this mean for you, sitting at your kitchen table, wondering why you feel poorer even when the news says the economy's fine? It means the safety you think you have is probably an illusion. Your retirement account, tied to markets inflated by cheap money. Your home, valued by buyers who can't afford it without ultra-low rates. Your paycheck, losing power as costs rise faster than wages. When this bubble breaks, and every bubble breaks, it won't look like 2008. There won't be families defaulting in droves because they borrowed too much. Instead, it'll be everything else that collapses around them. Stocks, pensions, 401ks, property values. Imagine it. A single unexpected shock, a geopolitical conflict, a credit downgrade, a policy mistake, and suddenly the wealth that looks so solid on paper evaporates. The Fed will step in, of course. It always does. They'll print more. They'll promise stability. But the more money they print, the more they weaken the value of what you already have. That's the cruel irony of modern finance. Each rescue plants the seeds of the next disaster. The same policies meant to protect your savings are the ones inflating the danger around them. And while the system inflates, ordinary Americans are suffocating. The cost of rent, food, and healthcare climbs relentlessly. The dream of home ownership moves further away. Meanwhile, corporate profits and asset values soar to record highs. That gap between the people who live off assets and the people who live off paychecks is now the real fault line of collapse. Because when the middle class can no longer believe the game is fair, the system itself starts to shake. You can already feel it. The anger, the polarization, the mistrust. These aren't side effects, they're symptoms. Every financial bubble becomes a social one before it bursts. So if you're wondering when the crash will come, less at Wall Street's charts and more at Main Street's mood. Because when faith disappears in money, in institutions, in fairness, the fall has already begun. Here's the truth no one in power will ever say out loud: every rescue, every bailout, every stimulus meant to save the system just welded another layer of fragility onto it. The Great Depression taught us the need for strict regulation, progressive taxes, and social safety nets. Those reforms worked for decades. They gave us stability, a thriving middle class, and trust in institutions. But since the 1980s, piece by piece, we've dismantled them. We deregulated finance. We cut taxes for the top. We let speculation replace productivity and debt replace wages. And now, we're reaping the consequences of that choice. We're standing inside a new kind of bubble, one created not by reckless borrowers, but by the very institutions meant to prevent collapse. A central bank engineered illusion built on cheap money and collective denial. The danger isn't that it will burst, the danger is that we no longer believe it can. Breaking this cycle won't come from another stimulus package or a new interest rate trick. It requires real structural change, separating essential banking from speculation, forcing anti-monopoly laws, restoring progressive taxation, and investing in productive capacity again. It means taking power back from the financial elite who've privatized gains and socialized losses for half a century. Because this isn't just about money. It's about survival, social, political, and moral. We can keep pretending that this time is different, or we can finally admit what history has screamed at us for 8 centuries. Every empire that ignores its own fragility eventually meets it. And if we want a different ending this time, we'll need the courage to rebuild the system not as gamblers chasing growth, but as citizens defending trust. Because they built this cycle, we inherited it. But what we do next, that's on us. If this changed how you see history, subscribe, because they've buried the truth for 200 years, and it's time we dug it back up.